There is an argument that claims there is an inherent contradiction between democracy and a nation-state, and of course this argument is made only about Israel. No one makes this claim about Germany or Greece or any other countries.
Hello everyone, you're here with us on the Tov channel, and during this period when the state of Israel is going through all kinds of processes, all kinds of changes, we see people crying out democracy in the streets, and the implication is that this is supposedly in opposition to the Jewish character of the state, to its traditionalism. And we know that the state of Israel is both Jewish and democratic. Is there a contradiction between these two things? Is the contradiction real? We want to talk about this with Professor Udi Manor, a historian. Professor Manor, when searching for the sources of democracy, people look at the laws of kings by Maimonides, and there they find the principle of legality and the principle of equality, all the democratic principles. So in other words, in some way, it's not really clear why people are perhaps artificially creating this sense that there's some kind of opposition between the Jewish and the democratic. What do you think? What's your opinion on the matter?
Look, the thing is that it comes from so many directions, and each one of them requires, how should I put it, their own segment or their 10 minutes or their time. There's one argument that says there's an inherent contradiction between democracy and a nation state, and of course this argument is only made about Israel. No one ever makes this claim about Germany or Greece or any other countries that are considered completely legitimate. One argument says and discusses the fact that the people who are speaking today, the dominant voices talking about Judaism today, for example, let's call it Netanyahu's coalition, which includes the ultra-Orthodox regardless of Netanyahu himself. He's referring to the people behind him from the distinctly Jewish religious side. Yes, I say distinct in the sense that there's no debate that the religious Zionists and the ultra-Orthodox, against them it's argued that they do not accept the democratic values of tolerance and pluralism and so on. And the proof of this is that they do not accept the Reform movement, which is also a Jewish religious movement, but not Orthodox. And so that's the contrast. And there's a completely different direction, actually the one I much prefer, and that's Ben-Gurion's approach. When Ben-Gurion, at the founding of the state in 1948, he talked about how he didn't want to write the word democracy because it's not that he didn't write it, but in the Declaration of Independence, because it has a Western connotation or meaning, and he says there is a Jewish democracy. If we need to sum up the difference between Western democracy, certainly as we know it today, and Jewish democracy, as Ben-Gurion intended it, as I understand it, then the issue is the gap between a society that is based mainly on individual rights. I deserve, and I define myself, and you won't tell me in all the narratives. And if today I want to be gender X, then I'm gender X, and in another 15 minutes I'll be gender Y. In contrast, Jewish democracy, the values as Ben-Gurion spoke about them, and without the religious, first and foremost speaks about duties, about the idea that we are part of a community in the broadest sense of the word, let's say the public, or in more abstract Latin terms, a republic. That is to say, Ben-Gurion's thinking actually strives for, or hints at, or points to republican democracy, which seeks some kind of balance between the individual and the collective. So here we have three reasons. Each one requires further in-depth discussion. And naturally, there are more reasons to challenge the claim, that is, to challenge Israeli democracy or the lack thereof. To this, you can add the issue of the occupation. There are those who argue that since there is an occupation, a country that occupies and does not allow democracy for the occupied citizens or women certainly cannot call itself democratic. You understand that each of these directions requires further attention.
Professor Manor, you mentioned a very interesting point. You say that in the Declaration of Independence, which is constantly being waved around, especially by those coming from the democracy side, the word democracy doesn't appear even once. And you say that Ben-Gurion did this intentionally. How should I put it? I haven't heard that before. Could you elaborate a bit on that point before we continue?
I'll say it again. He simply saw before his eyes what we call, some of us, a bit embarrassed because it sounds a bit strange today. Yes, but what can you do? Such a thing exists. The ethics of the prophets, okay? And the ethics of the prophets and in general the great ideas of the Bible were always before Ben-Gurion's eyes. Yes, and they didn't stop there. There is some famous document that has been circulating on the internet for at least 20 years in which Ben-Gurion writes in some letter, I don't remember to whom, that he says, I think that one shouldn't use the term husband, but personal. Yes, this is in the context of the gender discussion, where as soon as he says, it's that he's using the original meaning of the word Baal, not in the sense of the Canaanite god, but in the sense of ownership. And then he says, In modern relationship between partners, he thinks that in this regard, he has criticism of traditional Judaism, which sees some fundamental inequality between the man and the woman, between the partners.
Equality of men and women in Judaism is fundamental. But please go on, yes.
Exactly, he's quoting the verse.
But how does this connect, though, to the matter that he didn't want democracy, didn't want that term?
So what I'm saying is he basically says this, I'm trying to get into his mindset and put it in my own words. Yes, everything I'm about to say now is also related to the famous debate. Why wasn't a constitution enacted? Yes, he says, we are in the early stages of building. The state was declared in 48, but even in 1970, he says the state still hadn't taken shape, because it's one thing to declare a state and another thing to actually maintain a state. And in order to properly maintain a state, you need civic consciousness. The civic consciousness in Israel, which is made up of tens of Jewish communities who came here from dozens of countries, lands, and deserts, speaking dozens of languages, is something that develops over time, and therefore you can't set things in stone from the outset. Let's call it arbitrarily, and so you have to let things develop. And so he says we must have an internal discussion about the content of democracy, and that's why he says there's no need to include the word democracy in the Constitution, even though he can't really be suspected of opposing it. Yes, even though there were some who did suspect him, but I am not among them and I do not support their position. But let me finish the sentence. You can't suspect him of not supporting the basic rules of the game and democratic values, including those of the West. That is freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, political freedom, all of these things. Although I repeat, there were those who criticized him. Yes, for example, he used the shin bet to keep tabs on his opponents within Mapam. That's an act, how should we call it? An act that's, let's say, not very polite from a democratic standpoint, but overall, yes, people accuse him of being a dictator. No, he was not a dictator. He ran this country in a democratic manner, according to the circumstances, according to reality, and so on and so forth. And therefore, when he uses the word democracy, he is sensitive to the content, or to, how should we call it? To the connotation or to the semantic field that stands behind the word democracy. And if the word democracy might be interpreted in terms of, say, the famous 10 amendments of the American Constitution, which sanctify individual rights, the pursuit of happiness, and so on. And he says, no, we are now in a stage of building, so we need to approach these things in a much more moderate, measured, and balanced way, and to take into account the great values of the morality of the prophets. First of all, it's hard to know where to start. The term progressive has been abused over the past 10 years. Part of the coalition, in Ben-Gurion's first coalition, there was a progressive party. Look, the warning against losing the righteousness of the path, this was emphasized no less and no more by Ben-Gurion's closest friend, Berl Katznelson, about 20 years before Ben-Gurion even had to deal with the issue of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and so on, right? In the famous speech that Berl gave at Bialik's grave in 1934, right? That's 15 years, but that's a long time. So he was already talking about the potential problem, that people might forget where they came from. And he mentioned this on various occasions. And I mentioned Berl because he is the most important thinker of the labor movement, and Ben-Gurion, for that matter, is a senior partner of his. What do I mean by for that matter? He is his senior partner, and for Ben-Gurion, Berl's passing was a huge blow. When Berl passed away in 1944, Ben-Gurion truly felt orphaned. So in that sense, Ben-Gurion didn't need to wait, not for the 60s, not for the 70s, and not even for the 50s, to see the danger that Jews in Israel might forget where they came from and where they are supposed to go. And that's why his clear statement was that one must study the Bible, understand Jewish tradition, and engage in debate with it. You mentioned earlier the Rambam, of course. I mentioned Zionism. Ben-Gurion says some very harsh things about Zionism. He tells the Jews of America there is no longer Zionism because there is the state of Israel. Anyone who is a Zionist should immigrate to Israel. Does he really mean that Zionism is over? Of course not. So when we talk about a Jewish state and go back to the Declaration of Independence, the word democracy does not appear, but all the other components that make up a democracy do, right? Equality, religion, race, gender, all of these things, right? And we call upon our Arab neighbors, extending a hand for peace. We want to be part of the family of nations. All these things that are written in the Declaration of Independence are at the forefront of the minds of those who today criticize the current government and justifiably, from their perspective, are concerned about whether some of the coalition partners in the current government still support these values of the Declaration of Independence. As a citizen who did not support, who did not vote for this coalition, when I forget for a moment what I voted for, and I remind myself that the issue is not what I voted for or didn't vote for, but rather the future of the people of Israel, I feel a great deal of trust in most of the current coalition's members regarding their loyalty to the values of the Declaration of Independence. But it's important to understand that the debate is exactly at this point, not between traitors and loyalists, but between people who are suspicious. Now, this suspicion stems from all sorts of reasons, some more valid, some less credible. I think that's Ben-Gurion's legacy. Not that he always did it, but at least he said so. He meant that we should have a debate, let's call it a democratic Jewish debate, about the Jewish democratic content of the Jewish democratic state, because these things are constantly evolving, and we must not fall into the traps of civil war, name-calling, and factionalism, which, as we know, Jewish history shows us where that leads.
Professor Manor, to conclude, you said something that I'd like you, with your permission, to clarify as we wrap up. You said, look, friends, democracy is not a state ideology, it's not a national identity. It's the right way to conduct the discussion. What the content will be, what the solution will be, so to speak, is in no way contained in the word democracy itself. And here, this statement is so powerful because essentially, those who try to imagine that democracy is the opposite of Judaism when it's actually a principle in the Rambam are basically treating democracy as if it's an ideology. You're saying, friends, what are you talking about? You're talking about the rules of the game. You're not saying what the content will be, what the solution will be.
If I talk with people about Judaism, about the content of Judaism, the Bible, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and beyond, I don't find any contradiction. I can, however, look at what he wrote, look at what he said in this or that lecture, things that contradict democracy. So I say, yes, there are people who speak in the name of Judaism and say things that could endanger democracy. But democracy, if you look at things in a moderate and let's call it sane way, is a tool through which we are supposed to conduct the debate. Where are we headed? What do we want to achieve? What does it mean to be a Jewish people? What does Jewish identity mean? What does independence mean? What does sovereignty mean? What does peace mean? What does economy mean? And so on. All the questions that are the questions of our lives.